For all the wonderful films that one might watch during the Halloween season, there's a charming yet brief flick within the catalog that, though it has a passionate and loving following, often gets overlooked by many searching for entertainment in the spooky season. But for those that have the inside scoop, they know that this film holds a charm that elevates it beyond its ghoulish exterior. And if you've ever wondered how the talented team of creatives managed to put this complex classic together, then allow me to tell you the story of how Tim Burton's Corpse Bride was made. The story of Corpse Bride has a peculiar and somewhat elusive history. Tim Burton describes the origins of the idea with journalist Robin Rowe in an interview with Editors Guild magazine in 2005, telling how, quote, "After doing Nightmare Before Christmas, I was looking for something else to do in the same medium, because I love the stop-motion medium. A friend of mine gave me a little short story, a couple of paragraphs from an old folktale, and it captured my attention, and seemed right for this particular type of animation. It's such a special medium. It's like casting. You like to marry the medium with the material. And this seemed like a good match." That friend, according to the Black Case Diaries on October 11th, 2022, was likely Joe Ranft, a good friend of Burton's and one of the minds that helped launch Pixar. The reason for the elusiveness of the story is that, beyond Ranft, the story has a few potential origins. Several sources say that it originated as an old Russian folktale, often one specific tale titled The Finger, which itself is based on the early 19th century Russian killings of Jewish brides. That, however, is a topic for the Lore Lodge. Regardless of its origins, Tim held on to the idea and the desire to use it for another means of making a stop-motion film for a decade, until the time came when he was able to assemble the team to do it. At the top of that team was lead director Tim Burton himself, but for this production, he wouldn't be alone at the helm. Due to a unique set of circumstances, Burton found himself able to do Corpse Bride while he was already committed to making a live-action film at the same time. That film was Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Tim utilized his time at Pinewood Studios for the production of that film as an advantage, double-dipping some cast and crew from the major studio production into his own passion project. And just as a little aside, Pinewood Studios is in fact the same studio backlot set where they filmed the Star Wars films. They built all the sets there. It's just a little tidbit factoid. Most notable double-dipping are some of the cast members, specifically Johnny Depp, Christopher Lee, and, at the time, wife of Burton, Helena Bonham Carter. This also helped to reduce costs, since these cast members were already under contract for the Warner Brothers picture budgeted at $150 million, with a not inconsequential percentage of that budget going to the recent Pirates of the Caribbean, Star Wars, and Harry Potter alums respectively. This meant that they were both willing and able to take a significantly reduced rate to help their friend's passion project come to life, and this is according to Burton himself in one of the featurettes of the film. As a result of the unique responsibilities of directing two feature films at once, to help facilitate the day-to-day work of, as Burton puts it, quote, "slogging it out in the trenches," the help of co-director was sought in Mike Johnson, a longtime member of the animation field, but this would be his first endeavor as a director. There to support Johnson's efforts was Alison Abate, the film's lead producer and prolific animation producer, who was fresh off of the success of The Iron Giant and Looney Tunes Back in Action at the time. Pete Kozarczyk filled the role of director of photography, who had won the Oscar for his previous work with Burton on The Nightmare Before Christmas, and screenwriter John August, who also collaborated with Burton before and since The Corpse Bride. With the main production staff assembled, it was time to put together remaining cast and crew. Up first in the casting process, aside from Depp, Lee, and Carter, were the other members of the leading families of the film. Most notably was Emily Watson as love interest Victoria Everglot. Watson is an English Shakespearean-trained actress with a prolific catalog on screen and stage, the latter in which she was nominated for an Olivier Award in 2002 for her role in Donmar Warehouse. But you will likely know her best, as I do, for her outstanding performance as the Belarusian scientist Ulana Kyomuk, I believe I'm pronouncing that right, in what I personally consider to be the greatest series ever produced, HBO's Chernobyl. Playing Watson's parents in the film were Albert Finney and Joanna Lumley, two prolific English actors with extensive careers. Finney had recently received the Oscar for his supporting role in Erin Brockovich, and a Primetime Emmy Award for portraying Winston Churchill in HBO's The Gathering Storm. Joanna Lumley had a role in George Lazenby's only stint as Bond in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and had lent a voice on the Tim Burton-produced stop-motion film James and the Giant Peach in 1996. Depp's character's family was portrayed by Tracey Ullman and Paul Whitehouse. Ullman, an England-born actress, made her debut in Paul McCartney's film Give My Regards to Broad Street, and notably was the host to the origins of the animated series The Simpsons, which debuted on HBO's The Tracey Ullman Show as animated shorts, which, after the show's third and final season, were separately picked up by Fox as a 30-minute primetime series. Whitehouse, who later collaborated with Burton again on Alice in Wonderland, is a Welsh actor who cut his teeth on various BBC television and radio series, often of the sketch comedy variety. The primary antagonist of the film was portrayed by Richard E. Grant, a Swaziland-born English actor whose career has recently blossomed with works like Game of Thrones, Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker, and Saltburn. Rounding out the cast is British actress Jane Horrocks as the Black Widow Spider and Miss Plum, Scottish actor Anne Rydell as the Maggot and the Town Crier, British actor Stephen Ballantyne as Emile the Butler, Kenyan-British actor Deep Roy, who was also simultaneously playing every single Oompa Loompa in Burton's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and Michael Gough, who you may recognize as Alfred from Tim Burton's Batman series, played Elder Gunknecht. With the cast completed, it was time to assemble the talented team to create the physical and digital building blocks for the production. The below-the-line team members were Peter Saunders as a puppet maker, Nelson Lowry as the art director, Phil Dale as an animator, Andy Bowman, motion control supervisor, Carlos Grangel as the character designer, Ian McKinnon as a puppet maker, Annie Gent as lead model rigger, Anthony Scott as the animation supervisor, Graham G. Maiden as the puppet fabrication supervisor, Harry Linden as the production manager, Michelle Guiche was the casting director, Ezra J. Sumner is the first AD, Jeffrey Lynch was head of story, Roddy McDonald was the art department supervisor, Clive Scott was the chief lighting technician, and Chris Watts was the effects consultant. All of these people occurred in some way, shape, or form in some of the research that I did for this film. Not all of them are necessarily going to be mentioned by name from this point forward, but I felt it was important to highlight some of the key people that don't often get mentioned in productions like this, especially by name. They are in some of the featurettes, they're in some of the articles that I used as research material, but a lot of people don't watch all the way through the credits, and these people are remarkably important for getting a film like this made. Now that I've listed out some of the key below-the-line members of the team, it's important to start discussing how they went about preparing to start this production. According to Robin Rowe's article in Editors Guild magazine, in relation to the camera package selection for the movie, effects consultant Chris Watts was having dinner with a Warner Brothers visual effects senior vice president, Chris DeFaria, and Corpse Bride producer Abate while discussing the movie. Watts made it clear throughout the discussion, without necessarily intending to, that he had assumed that they were going to be shooting the movie on DSLR cameras, which was an unusual choice at the time, considering DSLRs were relatively new, and they were also digital, which again was relatively new. The director of photography, Pete Kozacek, had been considering the use of digital, but not of the consumer camera type. But the idea sparked a cascade of ideas in DeFaria's mind. With only a month of pre-production left after this dinner before they had to go into production and start shooting, they wasted no time in testing DSLR cameras. Still initially skeptical, there were 6 major questions the team felt they needed to answer before setting on a choice of camera, or camera type for that matter. Those questions were, are images from a digital stills camera consistent frame to frame? Is the quality comparable to film? Is the image quality stable under different thermal and humidity conditions? Could a system be devised for previewing animations on set? Could a system be devised to keep track of all the frames? And could a live videotape be created for a digital stills camera? To answer these questions, the production team acquired a variety of DSLR cameras for testing. Canon UK loaned a 10D, a 1D, a 1D Mark II, and a 1DS. Nikon loaned a D1X, a D100, and a D2H. Watts also tested cameras from both Sigma and Kodak. Initial tests were held at Framestore CFC and the Moving Picture Company in London. Watts confirmed to Rowe in his article that they had originally chosen the Nikon D2H for the production for the, quote, wireless FTP, the chip size, and the fact that we owned $90,000 worth of Nikon glass, which is another term for lenses. But as they progressed into pre-production camera testing, they discovered an issue. Despite its nice features, the Nikon produced visual noise pixelation in the dark areas of the shots, which contained inconsistencies across each individual frame of the stop-motion videos once they were assembled, a visual issue that would not pass the quality benchmarks needed for a studio feature film. As a result, the production decided to go with the Canon 1D Mark II. Though the Canon solved the noise issue for the Nikon, and a simple adapter would still allow them to use all of the Nikon glass that they had, the 1D Mark II had a unique problem of its own. The camera did not have a video out port. This is not a problem if you're planning on using the camera for its intended purpose of capturing images and looking through the eyepiece with your eye directly, but with all of the complex rigging and pre-programmed camera movements required of a stop-motion production, let alone the possibility of someone trying to line up a shot each time and inadvertently causing inconsistencies by accidentally knocking the camera off its mark, this meant that a solution needed to be developed. So, as Rowe recounts in his article, quote, DP Kozacek, Watts, and chief motion control technician Andy Bowman designed a rig that would allow a small video camera to be mounted to the back of the still camera body, but slide out of way when fine adjustments were necessary. In Tim Burton's discussion segment on the light and dark featurette, you can actually see one of the Canon 1D Mark IIs behind him to the right of the screen. On that camera is the apparatus utilized to get around the issue of the 1D Mark II not having a video out, the optical lens mechanically fixed behind the viewfinder of the camera. Rowe continues to enumerate that the production bought 24 of the Canon. The original plan was for lighting stations to have a full system at each of the 24 sets, but that ended up being cost prohibitive. 7 lighting crews shared one station on a mobile cart. Each cart included a Macintosh, Photoshop, and a suite of JavaScript, AppleScript, and QuickTime tools to enable the lighting crews to view their work as it was developing. Which brings us to the other budget multiplier of the film, the puppets. Early in the pre-production period, Tim Burton provided designs and sketches to the design team that he had done well before the project began, of what he had initially visualized each character to be. Character designer Carlos Grangel of Spain then took these drawings and developed them to far greater detail, revising Burton's visions until they could lock down the exact look of each character in the film in a 2D drawing, before moving to the creation of 3D puppets. In the character design featurette, Carlos describes the design process, emphasizing that, quote, every character has his own personality, and personality dictates shape, balance, and rhythm. So, every character has his own silhouette. So, what is important is that we can recognize every single character when we see them on screen. And they are puppets, so they have to be really graphic and really stylized. So we had to create many shapes. Once the designs for the puppets were locked in, the next step was to move into the production of the physical puppets themselves. Co-director Mike Johnson confirms that, quote, the puppets were built by McKinnon and Saunders up in Manchester, who are the premier puppet makers in the world, and they've been involved in most stop-motion projects that have been going on in the past 20 years, as of the production of that film. A wealth of information about the design and creation of the puppets for this film comes from Ron Barbagallo's article, From Concept Art to Finished Puppets, an interview with Graham G. Maiden, puppet fabrication supervisor on The Corpse Bride, which was published by Animation Art Conservation in 2005. I'll summarize some of the important points here, but for a more in-depth look at the process, I highly suggest giving his article a read, along with all other articles I've referenced throughout this video. Barbagallo notes that Maiden was responsible for general supervision, alterations, repairs, and production of duplicates of the puppets during the production. He was made aware of the project in 1996 when he saw early design sculptures by Burton of what Corpse Bride would look like. When the time came for the official production, Maiden notes that the team started with maquettes, a form of rough draft in this kind of work, where they would test fabrics, colors, and sizings of body elements to determine the best aesthetic and practical applications, meticulously overseen by both Burton and Johnson. An issue realized early on was a result of Burton's desired proportions for the puppets: lanky, tall, and tiny feet. Maiden tells Barbagallo that, quote, they resolved a lot of these problems by consulting Merrick Cheney. He continues to say that Merrick Cheney worked on Nightmare Before Christmas, so he dealt with a lot of these types of problems before with Jack Skellington. He has quite a unique way of making an armature. The actual angle and knee have to be extremely strong. Merrick has a copyright on that, so I don't know exactly how he does it. This is particularly true of the character Scraps, the little skeleton dog, whose feet were so small that he always required an external rig to hold him up into position. Various methods were used to develop the clothing for the characters, some with external clothes, and others required clothing to be fashioned as part of their bodies for efficiency, but designed with foam wrapped around copper wire so they could be animated. All fabric was hand-dyed due to the specific color palette requests of the art director Nelson Lowry. Over 300 puppets were built in total for the 30 characters of this film, with reports being that the prices reached as high as $30,000 per puppet, and this is in 2005. They had created 14 brides, 14 victors, and 13 Victorias in order to be able to have multiple setups running simultaneously for efficiency, since a single shot could take over a day to complete. Maiden adds that the number sounds outrageous, but we actually did because some shots we shoot only saw her legs and some we only saw her upper torso. We literally cut her in half. We could have done with more, to be honest with you. The majority of the characters we thought we could get by maybe 2 of, but we ended up getting a lot more of them. Here's a character called Barkus, and in the first few scripts he wasn't much of a character, but he eventually became more and more, so we ended up making 7 of him, when originally it was meant to be 5. We made 7 because he became such a strong character. One of the things that made the presence of the characters so strong was their unique ability to emote at the hands of the animators. The puppets have mechanical faces that had been previously used in some large-scale puppet commercials with Lipton iced tea, but according to co-director Mike Johnson in the film's featurettes, this was the first time that they had been pushed to this extreme in a small scale and size and its complexity. This was a major goal of Mike during the production, to provide the animators more flexibility and autonomy in the performance of the puppets. Usually in stop-motion animation, prior to this, and in some subsequently, they would replace the faces with different forms of emotion and expression to be able to get those different emotions and expressions or dialogue elements from the performance. But with the internal gearing, they were able to get much more refined and subtle performances from the puppets. Going back to Barbagallo's article, Graham Maiden explains how they, quote, managed to get a gearing system the size of a small orange and have it accessible through the back of the head. Paddles and strings with fixing points within the skin were attached to the gearing system. This allowed us to manipulate the puppet's expressions. The puppet of Victoria, for example, has a hole in her bow, in her hair, and also in her ears, as does Corpse Bride and Victor. You access the gearing system with an Allen key and turn the gears to open and close her mouth. That way they can make her smile or pout. The heads also have paddles in them to make the eyebrows raise or fall, so they can either look surprised, angry, or serious. Aside from the difficulty of the faces, there was also great struggle with the other parts of the characters that reacted to movement, such as clothing and hair, nowhere more intricate than on Corpse Bride herself. In the featurettes of the film, they described the methods of movement for the bride's clothing, which included wires running throughout the bride's veil, external rigs that would assist in moving the veil and dress with the wind, and a clear plastic dome that could be adjusted below the dress to create a wind-flowing effect. This process took 2 weeks of trial and error before they got something that was reliable and natural looking. One rig that was particularly fun and relatively simple, designed for the women puppets with long dresses, provides the ability to raise and lower the whole puppet incrementally, creating a bounce that emulated walking. As for Corpse Bride's hair, Maiden tells Barbagallo of a process involving a combination of a brass skull cap that had wires that were attached to foam that was baked over it. Over this, mohair was impregnated with silicone. We individually looped and curled the hair with the silicone and glued that to her head. We didn't want any crawl to occur during animation, or, anything moving around that we didn't intend. Graham continues on to tell Barbagallo that due to the high standards of a professional production like this, it took nearly 3 years from start to finish for the puppet development, from maquette to final product. And even once they'd locked into the design after about approximately 18 months, they still found themselves changing and refining as the needs of the production presented themselves throughout the shooting schedule. Part of those needs that were discovered came from certain elements of the production design, from which director of photography and visual effects supervisor Pete Kozacek was responsible. At the time, they were the largest stop-motion sets ever constructed, as high as 16 feet and as deep as 30 feet. These were surpassed in recent memory, notably to a grand scale, by the 2011 Guinness World Record holding film Gulp, which utilized a 11,033 square foot section of Welch Beach. Now, granted, that's an existing beach, not necessarily a constructed set, and I couldn't find anything of solid foundation to counter the idea that Corpse Bride's physically built sets have ever been surpassed, so I'm gonna maintain the title for them. despite Gulp's Beach Day. In conversation with Desowitz, Kozacek noted that they had to, quote, split these two worlds apart and find a way to make them look instantly recognizable, but not be making two separate movies, which is quite a trick, having 7 crews working on different sequences all at the same time. Color was a way to separate, Pete went on. I tried to throw everything we have in our camera tool set to separate it as well. Keep real staid and level and sensible when shooting the real world, and shoot in near black and white. No fancy camera moves and no fancy angles. We maintained a whole different take on the camera work in Land of the Dead. Again, not too much color, but the presence of it becomes a surprise. We didn't want the Land of the Living to be too boring, so we ended up mixing it up a little bit. With the sets and stars ready, it was time to say lights, camera, action. And by that I mean officially start production. As previously mentioned, as production began on The Corpse Bride, Tim Burton was simultaneously shooting Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. As a result, Tim would record lines with the actors for The Corpse Bride after full days on the candy-filled set, at times with actors who had also just put in a full day on that set. In the featurettes of the film, these actors shared their thoughts on the process of creating a stop-motion picture, lending only their voices to the story. Depp and Bonham Carter found it pretty freeing, with the latter stating, quote, "It's so nice to act something when it's so not dependent on what you look like, so you can completely create a character and you're not limited by your physical envelope." She went on to say, "In a way, it's sort of pure acting, because you don't have anything. You can be entirely selfish. You don't have any marks to hit." Emily Watson, on the other hand, with the voice of Victoria, found the experience slightly less liberating, noting, quote, "I have scenes with Johnny Depp and Joanna Lumley and Albert Finney, and I've never met any of them. It's really, you just have to imagine most of it in your head." While the actors were able to fulfill their duties in the studio as somewhat of an after-hours gig, it was very much not so for the rest of the production staff. Editor Jonathan Lucas recounts the chaos with Rob and Rowe, noting that, quote, "shooting is monumental, and that, as an editor, you are a lot more patient." That patience is in relation to the shooting schedule, as Lucas points out directly, noting that, quote, "most features shoot in about 12 to 14 weeks. But with Corpse Bride, it's 52 weeks. We only get 2 minutes of film a week with stop motion. One shot can take 3 weeks. Despite the immense patience it required on that schedule, there were still benefits to the snail's pace, as it allowed Mike Johnson and company to continually refine and perfect the story on a daily basis. Bill Desowitz also adds in his article that, from the camera side, quote, "the digital technology also provided greater flexibility with camera moves, as Armatron rigs allowed the camera to get much closer to the puppets and move three-dimensionally around them and the sets, such as with the sweeping opening and the whirling 360-degree turns on the bridge between Victor and Corpse Bride." And as you might expect, with such a long production schedule, certain adaptations to the filmmaking process needed to be made. Unlike a typical production schedule, many of the post-production elements, such as music, sound effects, and general editing, were occurring on a day-to-day basis alongside production. Much of this has to do with the production pipeline of stop-motion animation, where audio files including the performance of the actors, music, and sound effects were needed ahead of time in order for the animators to be able to effectively match the timing of those elements with their work. One of the most striking of these elements is the music, written and composed by Danny Elfman. This film marked nearly 2 decades of collaboration between Elfman and director Tim Burton, but according to the two of them within the featurette interviews, little has changed since they first started their journey together back on Pee-wee's Big Adventure. At the beginning of his process for the film, Elfman started with Victor's theme, the song that the character is seen playing on the piano early in the film. The composer's reasoning for this starting place is precisely because of the intricacy of developing a tune that will be shown being played by a stop-motion puppet. As a result, this piece ended up informing Elfman's process through the rest of the film, coming back to this musical motif throughout the movie. He also composed and personally plays the other piano track in the film as well, where the bride and Victor play together on screen. Elfman took it a step further with the song Remains of the Day, performed by the skeleton puppet Bone Jangles in The Land of the Dead, not only writing the music and lyrics, but also lending his own talents to the vocals. In one of the Blu-ray featurettes, Elfman notes that he had, quote, "intended for a gruffer voice, and we auditioned 25, 26, 27 people at least, and finally Tim called me and he said, look, would you mind just doing the song, the Bone Jangle song?" And so he did. In terms of orchestral composition, Elfman pre-records a lot of percussion prior to the recording session, and then will bring those files in and have them play alongside the live orchestra, which he oversees and directs, but does not conduct. Elfman prefers to obtain any non-traditional sounds and instruments ahead of time to prevent any precarious microphone placement or overly complex variables that could delay recording sessions from moving along as normally expected. The job of conducting is left to English conductor Nick Ingman, a prolific Berklee College of Music educated composer and conductor who has collaborated with the likes of Paul McCartney, Mick Jagger, Bjork, Elton John, David Bowie, Radiohead, Oasis, and many other artists throughout his time. Ingman also contributed to several hundred radio tracks for various American radio stations and was an orchestrator and conductor for the films Shakespeare in Love, Billy Elliot, Nowhere Bay, and The Passion of the Christ. As the music is being refined, so is the assembly of each meticulously captured shot of the film in the process of editorial, or as we frequently call it now, editing. Much of what we know of the process of editing The Corpse Bride comes from Robin Rowe's article Bride Stripped Bare, published in Editors Guild magazine in 2005. Rowe interviewed a number of members of the crew and was able to provide an ample insight to the behind-the-screens workings of the post-production process for the film, of which I subsequently will refer to. In Rowe's discussions with editor Jonathan Lucas, Lucas elaborated that much of the process of editing on this film was heavily informed by the storyboards developed in pre-production, as most shots that were generated on sets ended up looking near identical to their drawn counterparts. This was in no small feat, as Lucas noted, quote, "At one point, we had 5 or 6 storyboard artists working 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. And that the decision on every single shot's placement is, quote, fine-tuned for months on end until a director says he's happy." While assembling the shots in a timeline, Lucas's responsibility as editor was to also take into account the context of the voice performances, preliminary sound effects, more specialized and finalized versions provided by the company Sound Deluxe of those sound effects, music in whatever state it was delivered, be it temporary stand-in tracks or final compositions, or even lines that had to be re-recorded through the process. It was Lucas's responsibility to sift through every combination of the aforementioned variables, and through that, find the best groupings to achieve the vision set forth by the director. Once each piece is compiled, they would individually be reviewed by him and the directors, Burton and Johnson, for approval, and then he would move on to the next segment. If you've ever wondered why editing takes so long, this is why. Especially on an animation project such as this. Another extension to the schedule of this project, for Lucas at least, was his self-imposed crash course in working on Final Cut Pro as an editing software, which was selected for this picture as opposed to the at-the-time industry standard of Avid, largely for budgetary reasons. Lucas explained to Rowe that it took him 2 weeks to master the software, and that, quote, Final Cut Pro generates XML data of shot information. XML data, which is just specifically formatted text, is much easier to integrate into animation pipelines. For Corpse Bride, data wrangler and computer programmer Martin Pellingley Phillips wrote a utility in Python computer language to convert the XML data into flattened reels. The shots then get validated for naming and length, and checked against the list of known shots in the editorial database in FileMaker Pro. In Python, a series of Apple scripts are created to update the editorial database with the most recent cut. If that sounded a lot like just a slew of jargon, basically the formatting that they decided on using required specific software to then learn and understand and utilize and categorize all of the metadata of the shots that they were making. Despite the transition to Final Cut for this seeming improvement in workflow, it still wasn't enough. First assistant Ralph Foster discussed with Rowe that, quote, having so many JPEG still frames seems to challenge the system. That demand is unique to stop motion production. Adding more RAM to the computers didn't help, so to cut down on JPEG overhead, the files were converted into QuickTime. QuickTime is a video playback format specifically designed to be compatible with Apple computers, which were and still are the standard hardware system for the film industry, which is something that was made very apparent to me when I personally acquired my first Alexa camera and discovered that I could not download the footage off the codec's capture drive because the hardware and firmware could not be read by a PC computer, which is and has always been my primary means of working with video files in both Adobe and Blackmagic software. I've used Macs in the past, especially when I first started out. I've just found that PCs work best for my personal workflow, but I guess not so much anymore. Foster continued on that for, quote, projection playback, Iridos Frame Cycler was run on a box PC, and for those of you unaware of either of those tools, don't worry, neither was I before today. Iridos Frame Cycler is a playback tool used in the film industry to view uncompressed files or raw data files. A discussion of sample and bit rates of sensors is for another time, and to put Put it simply, uncompressed files retain the specific ones and zeros of the data from the sensor, so they provide the maximal amount of information that was actually captured by the camera. But those ones and zeros can't be viewed on a computer without being compressed into a video file format or with some kind of software like Iridos. And the hardware upon which they did that was a Box Computer, which is a brand specifically geared toward developing PCs for digital art, 3D modeling, and CAD design. All workflows that demand strong hardware and software benchmarks. Also ironic considering that they were using Macs for the primary editing of it, but they were processing the images in PCs, so I don't know, interesting. Despite the usage of the Box Computer for the means of viewing the raw data, Lucas's primary editing computer remained an Apple G5 for the compatibility with the output files, as previously mentioned. It's an interesting workflow, but, whatever works. Foster added that, quote, in the Iridos software, 1.85:1 masking was applied, as well as simple color adjustments, such as printer lights, saturation, contrast, and gamma, without disrupting the basic calibration. 1.85 is in relation to the aspect ratio of the film. It's very close to 16:9, which by all likelihood is the format of frame that you are watching this video on. Again, aspect ratios deserve their own video. I will most likely be putting things like that on my personal channel, Aiden Thornberry, to discuss a little bit more of the technical aspects of just cameras and video in general, rather than actually just talking about movies. Yeah, there's a lot going on here at the Lodge. Foster also noted that the company Filmlight designed a proprietary 3D color cube software for the digital projector that would convert the raw files on the fly to a Cineon file, with the look as if they had been shot on 5248 film stock. Checking back in with Jonathan Lucas, he added that Final Cut can be more user-friendly than the comparison to the standard of Avid, saying, quote, you can extend a shot without going into trim mode. With Avid, you always had to think what tracks to push down. But while it has its pros of a friendly user interface, and particularly being far lower in cost than Avid, Lucas added that there were definitely challenges, to the likes of having, quote, an awful lot of JPEG storyboards, sometimes up to 12 soundtracks, and even more than 6 layers of videos. I autosave a lot, Lucas concluded. While Avid and Final Cut are both solid editing software, they are not built for visual effects. For those jobs, the hundreds of files were sent to London's moving picture company. Greater detail of the VFX process was provided by Bill Desowitz in his article, Corpse Bride Stop Motion Goes Digital, published to Animation World Network on September 16, 2005. Desowitz noted that Oscar-winning cinematographer Pete Kozacek pulled double duty on this project, working as the visual effects supervisor as well. In his role, Kozacek worked closely with Moving Picture Company, also known as MPC, on the 460 digital shots throughout the film, which were supervised by Jessica Norman. The effects work provided by MPC's work for this specific project primarily focused on enhancing what was already captured on screen, as opposed to modern VFX work, which requires the creation and addition of extensive digital elements throughout a scene. These enhancements included removal of support rods and wires used to prop up the puppets during a scene, and removing the motion control rigs that managed the complex camera moves around the miniature sets. For some scenes, they would also add various composite layers of fog and smoke as well. Additionally, the team created some complex 3D elements, such as the Corpse Bride's fluttering veil, where it was critical that the motion exactly matched that of the stop-motion puppets. Bats and crows were also CG enhanced for more complicated movements. Desowitz continued to provide detail of the collaboration, noting that MPC set up a satellite office at 3 Mills, the studios to which they were producing the film, to facilitate instant feedback and hands-on supervision from the directors and Kozacek. This facility enabled the team to deliver final shots while the first unit was still shooting. As an additional note, the film was color graded by Max Horton in the MPC DI Lab, or Digital Intermediate Lab. Closing on some information from Foster's article, back with Lucas and his editing suite, it's worth noting that the production software also incorporated the open-source DC Raw command line computer program and TrueLight's proprietary color transforms, which assisted in the resizing and annotation of each clip in the editorial process by generating code that directed the software Apple Shake, which is a now discontinued software that utilized early implementations of node-based digital compositing, similar to that which might be seen in today's modern Blackmagic's DaVinci Resolve, to produce QuickTime files for editorial and 2K DPX sequences to match the color profile of 5248 film scans. DPX is another film file format utilized in the film industry for providing lossless image formats of raw data, i.e. they retain all visual data without losing any information. Foster concluded his description of the file pipeline by confirming that despite the fact that even at the time in 2005, Canon could shoot stills in 4K, the images were wrangled at 2K because that would be the final output with the RE laser. I'll discuss a little bit more about what RE laser is in a minute, but for now, as all of the elements of the work were assembled and prepared for that process, the work could finally begin for pre-release. As previously mentioned in the post-production chapter, the film was released in 2K format to be compatible with RE laser. The RE laser is a film recorder, which is a unique piece of technology that was used to convert digitally edited films back into physical film stock by exposing physical film to a digitally projected version of the movie in a similar way to how standard film cameras would capture moving images on a set on location through a lens. This process was necessitated by the fact that despite more and more films being shot on digital throughout the 2000s, or at the very least being captured on film but edited as a digital intermediate on computer-based non-linear editing software like Avid and Final Cut, most movie theaters at the time were still projecting on film-based projectors. It was only in the early 2010s where most cinemas had officially converted to digital projection of films. So up to that point, films needed to be reprocessed from their digital editing format back onto rolls of film to be distributed to theaters for wide release. Interestingly, in RE's technical manual for the RE laser, they note that every model that they made of the RE laser that had ever been produced was capable of 4K resolution conversion to film, which leads me to assume that the reason that they delivered in 2K was less about compatibility and more for the budgetary purposes. And the highlight of 2K was probably less about the emphasis on the high quality, but more a remark that they couldn't go any lower because the lowest resolution for the RE laser was 2K. Nevertheless, at this stage, the project was complete and ready to be seen by audiences. All that was needed now was to ensure that people would actually show up at the theaters, and that's where the marketing push began. As with most films, Warner Bros. Released a poster for the film to be hung at cinemas and other points of interest around the globe, along with a teaser and subsequent theatrical trailer leading up to the release of the film. Both of the trailers were received relatively well, with the only real difference between the two being that the theatrical trailer had that classic 2000s narrator reciting the plot of the film in a relatively poetic manner. What is particularly fun about this film was the interactive website they created to help market it, allowing visitors to discover each of the unique locations of the movie, such as the pub where you could watch the trailer, or play darts to uncover even more video footage, or explore the village square of the living or the dead, respectively, and interact with other objects to uncover even more secrets, such as the character profiles, production notes, and more. Chris Thilk has a full breakdown of the website and its features in his article Movie Marketing Madness Corpse Bride on FilmThread. This kind of marketing tactic reminded me of some of the other viral trends in marketing for films that happened in the early 2000s. Such examples would be the ARGs that were made for the Cloverfield movies, which there are some great videos on YouTube about those. I wish I was around in a more conscious state at those times because it seems like really fun. There's also the Blair Witch Project's marketing campaign, which was extremely viral, and we have a video about on the Lore Lodge. The movie, not the marketing campaign, but the marketing campaign's a little bit of a part of it as well, so go check that out. As fun as the website sounds, the only way to know if it was worth the effort was to see how things turned out on the weekend of September 20th, 2005, when The Corpse Bride was released to the world. When The Corpse Bride hit theaters, it did reasonably well, making a little over $19 million in its opening weekend, and eventually closing out with a worldwide total of $118 million, which, adjusted for inflation, would be just under $193 million now, which, having only been 20 years ago, is really horrible. Making a profit of $118 million against a budget of $40 million, it more than made its money back, and that's even before home video sales were accounted for. As of 2009, which is the latest year I could find, DVD and Blu-ray sales totaled $38.5 million, which puts the production well into the black. Money aside, the film received widely positive praise from both viewers and critics alike at the time. It retains an 85% on Rotten Tomatoes to this day and a 7.4 out of 10 on IMDb. But the mark of a great film isn't just how it does initially, it's about how it carries on through time. We could also call this the David Cornsweet scale of a good movie. Tim Burton's Corpse Bride is an intriguing film, both in content and in reputation. Though it is one of his lesser recognized works, when it is with great passion. It was a surprise to find in putting this video together that it was such a pioneer of so many different aspects of the filmmaking process, especially in regards to stop motion. I only picked it because of the 20th anniversary and because of its notoriety as a solid staple of the Halloween season. I wasn't even previously aware that it was nominated for an Oscar for animated feature. But with Burton at the helm, I really should have expected that there would be more than meets the eye when it comes to Corpse Bride. My name's Aiden, thank you for stopping by, and hope to see you on the next episode here on Silver Retention.